Thank you very much. Very good to see you all there. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. It's in the evening here in Madagascar, so I guess the light isn't all that good. I'm a bit pixelated, sorry about that, but very good to be with you. A very quick additional word about me. I used to be the head of the IUCN office in Washington, DC, the Office for North America. And I worked a lot with finance institutions and biodiversity partners in the US, including Arizona State University, on issues to do with mobilizing support for conservation from the finance sector, including public and private banks. I'm here in Madagascar because I'm working on biodiversity issues at a more local context here. I used to live here. I spent 20 years here in the past. And I'm now trying to figure out how it is I can apply all that knowledge to how it is that conservation can happen on the ground. I'm going to speak to you today about the species threat abatement and restoration metric, but that's just the narrow focus of the talk I want to give. There's a lot of wider context that I would like to be able to work through as well, which gives you the context, the reason why it is I want to focus on STAR, because I think it's a very important thing that is emerging as an opportunity to change the way that the finance sector is working. So I'm going to try and share my screen at this point. Who knows whether that will work or not. So tell me if you can see a screen with a title slide on it. I hope you can.
Yes, it looks good.
Perfect, good. So I'm going to describe to you the STAR metric today, which is a collaboration led by the four institutions you see at the bottom there, but in fact produced as a tool by a consortium of 85 or so authors from nearly 100 institutions around the world. So it's very much a widely diversified effort to corral the complicated concept of biodiversity and make it available for the world to use as a metric for how it is you can succeed in conservation. So how do I? Good. Okay, you're seeing the next slide. Is that all working to plan?
Yes.
Good. I've in many of these slides, I've introduced some photographs of Malagasy biodiversity. So there will be a prize at the end, maybe theoretical, for anybody who can tell me what they all are without reading the logos on the slides. So that's the first one up there. So just as a summary of my talk today, I'm going to talk to you about STAR. We're going to start off by identifying the problem that it was designed to solve. And the big issue, of course, is that the economy that we live in, we all benefit from, we all participate in, doesn't know about biodiversity, doesn't invest in biodiversity, it can't see biodiversity. And the result of that is that we're using biodiversity up. It's a free gift to our economy, and it's going to run out. That's not a very good situation to be in, obviously. And the don't look up paradox, I'm sure some of you may have seen the movie recently. The paradox there is that while the issue may be extremely important, as it is in Don't Look Up, we're extremely bad at telling people how it is that they can react to that situation, to the point where in the movie, we all get blown up. Well, that's essentially the same story with biodiversity. It's among the most important things that we need to do to convince people this is an issue that they can measure. So the plan is that we want to be able to convey a message about what it is that governments and business do to biodiversity that can actually enable them to react in an appropriate way. And the way in which I've framed this is that governments and business like to be able to react to risks and opportunities. Those are the two words which enable them to plan their policy and their corporate strategies in such a way that they can respond to biodiversity. And STAR is a specific contribution to that process, to making biodiversity risks and opportunities measurable. And the thing about STAR is that it's place-based. It's very focused on how it is that you can adjust and change the circumstances on the ground. But you can also scale it up to whatever scale you like. It's scientific, it's based on a very large amount of data, and it's responsive. It shows you how things can change as a result of the changes in your appreciation of risks and your seizing of opportunities. So a couple of background things I'm sure you're aware of. The global economy is essentially subsidized by the natural world. More than half of our global economic output is moderately or highly dependent on biodiversity and the natural environment in general. And it's very likely that we're at the point right now where the ability of that system to support us is changing. It could well be that we've already gone too far, in fact. And it's quite clear from those great tree huggers in the business world that they regard loss of nature as big a risk as climate change. However, the realization is there that financial institutions and companies do not have the information they need to understand in order to be able to assess the risks they're exposed to. They can't get their hands around biodiversity. There's no way in which they can grasp how it is that they can manage biodiversity. That's the fundamental problem we have. And the result of that is, as I put this rather glibly at the bottom of this presentation, if you can't measure it, then I'll have it. It's mine. If you can't tell me why it is that that's important, but I can make money out of it, then our global economy, again, of which we are all part, says, I will just have it and I will liquidate it and I will transform it and I'll make it into something that's got value for other people. So we need to make sure that we can measure it and put value on it to the extent that we can defend that importance to the corporate world. The way we've approached this in the past is by framing things in terms of the global, the conventional biological diversity in the Aichi biodiversity targets. So this was our goal by 2020. The extinction of known threatened species has been prevented and their conservation status, particularly those of most inclined, has been improved and sustained. We didn't manage to do that. The target has not been met, basically. And the reason for that is because it was left up to governments to do that. And the very small piece of government, which is usually embodied in the Ministry of Environment, was given the essential task of delivering that outcome. And of course, they simply cannot because the economic system is not aligned with them to be able to achieve that goal. We have, however, had lots of successes. We've done all these things, which are very important steps in demonstrating that conservation action actually works. But we haven't managed to persuade anybody outside our narrow world why that's important. That's the big challenge we've really failed to deliver on. So we've got now the draft of the new post-2020 biodiversity framework, where the relationship between biodiversity and the economic system is framed in terms of reducing threats. And that's a really important step because the threats are things that are caused by money. They are things that money flows down channels and they cause threats to happen. And in this framing, we have all these threats here which we need to reduce, which will lead to the goals from 2030, the conservation of species in ecosystems, and the 2050 goals. We're all living in a healthy, resilient world with nice ecosystems and healthy species. That's a big ask. How do we get from the management of those threats to the conservation of species and ecosystems and an economy which actually supports all that? That's the big challenge. But at least we have that explicit linkage now between the existence of these threats, which are influenced by money, and connection to the biodiversity on the ground. So we have all these public finance commitments that have been made during the CBD COP26 in Glasgow last year, which mostly talk about the flow of money, which is great. And we've got these commitments which talk about reducing forest loss and improving the coverage of protected areas. One of the phrases that comes out more and more is that the corporate world, the finance world, has to be nature positive in some way. And that's a very admirable expression of intent, but it's very hard to know exactly how you can be nature positive if you're a company, if you don't have really any idea what nature consists of. You can point to pandas or whales or tigers and things and say, well, right, okay, we'll have more of them. But what does that get you? Where does that benefit them? Why should it be that they would want to do that other than to look good? And many of them do that to look good, but it doesn't get us to the root of the problem. Now we have our recommendation for the species goal for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. that we halt species extinctions from 2020, bit of an ask given that it's already passed, and that we reduce the risk of species extinctions to zero by 2050. That's a really important challenge. We need to then know how it is we measure the risk to species extinctions. So, hence the opportunity we have for making a difference with START. I'll come back to that in a minute. The big question that's begged by that is who and what needs to change? Another component of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework is that target 19, I believe, is that we need to increase the financial resources to go to conservation to at least 200 billion a year. That's actually only about a third of the total gap there is to cover finance for conservation. But anyway, it's a start. And you need to increase by 66 billion per year of that 200 international finance flows to developing countries. Now, the way that that number has been calculated is basically, it says that of all the impacts that happen to biodiversity, about a third of them are driven by consumption by developed countries of commodities that are produced in developing countries. You can see this kind of graphic at the bottom here, which shows you how it is that the municipalities in Brazil provide beef to consumers in Russia. And there's a whole sequence of channels through which that money and beef passes. So we have to be able to make a link between the impact that people in Russia have. This could be any country in the world, US or UK or whoever, but they're all buying material from places in the world where biodiversity is suffering as a result. So the responsibility should be for those consumer countries to respect that impact and support the investment in those places to reduce the impact on biodiversity. And the way you do that is by assessing biodiversity-related risks and opportunities in order that the money can flow to the places where you really need that impact to happen. So if we're talking about nature positive, what does that really mean? There's two ways in which you can imagine nature positive outcomes to be realized. One is by moving money towards positive impacts on biodiversity. That's what we think of as the opportunity. You can make money doing this. It's a way of generating a return on investment. So it's good for the economy, but it's also generating biodiversity as what we call a desirable global public good. And there are various frameworks within which these contributions will be made, in addition to the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. There's environmental profit and loss accounting, there's the task force for nature-based financial disclosure, there's the system of economic and environmental accounting, and for governments, the post-2020 framework. That all gives companies and governments the framework within which they can put their contributions to conserving biodiversity. And the ideal would be that they all are able to do that because they think they can make money out of it. It's part of a new focused economy on conserving biodiversity. And there's lots of ways that this can happen, lots of programs where you can generate biodiversity impacts that create jobs for people, that where you have sustainable production of different kinds of certified commodities that consumers will pay for, all those kinds of things. The other way you can do this is more the kind of stick aspect as opposed to the carrot, which is to point out to companies when they're damaging the environment that that's a cost that they're imposing on other people, us, basically, because we won't have a future if they can't reduce their impact on biodiversity. So there's been a lot of work figuring out what those different components of risk look like. So you can imagine that risks can include things like impacts where companies deliberately destroy habitats that are rich for biodiversity because they can make money out of the things that come out of that, say timber, or they can use the land in different ways for agriculture or for mining. This can give them dependency risk, which is linked to their ability to produce products. So if they go out and destroy all the pollinators, it might be that you're not able to produce chocolate anymore because it depends on the pollinators. It might be a liability risk because the company is sued for damaging biodiversity because biodiversity is a common public good that they are then depriving people of. And There are all kinds of transformation risks associated with new legislation that will come in that restrict companies' ability to operate through destruction of biodiversity. The problem with this is that you need to be able to measure that risk and opportunity in relation to biodiversity if you want to be able to impose those rules on companies such that they are incentivized to move towards opportunity and disincentivized to move away from risk. So what does a useful biodiversity metric for this purpose look like? Well, first of all, it's got to be related to some central component of biodiversity. Some of the three basic components of biodiversity are ecosystems, species, and genes. You've got to link your metric to a component of biodiversity that is well understood. It's got to be spatially explicit. If you were to convert an area of forest to agriculture in one part of the world where you're destroying a lot of natural habitat, that's a really big risk for you. However, you can work potentially 3 kilometers away in a place where there isn't any biodiversity and it's fine. You have to know where it is your impact is going to happen if you're to be able to evaluate your risk and opportunity. It's got to be quantitative. You have to say the risk that I undergo or the opportunity that I have identified here is bigger in Peru here than it is in Cameroon or in Papua New Guinea or Indonesia. You have to be able to compare those different things. And for a company, you have to be able to add these things up. You have to be able to say, my total biodiversity footprint across the world is X 500. And I know that I can deliver some unit of biodiversity that will be a contribution to that global target because of the composite actions I'm undertaking in lots of different places. And it has to be temporally responsive. You have to be able to tell your investors that you change things over a period of time, which relates to the budgeting process of the company. If it's a yearly process, you have to be able to say, I put $5 million into this year, and this is the result I generated out of it. Very hard to do if you're trying to measure biodiversity impacts, because of course they change usually over longer timescales than that. I've just put this reminder about the threats thing at the bottom there, because that's the key to being able to link all those characteristics there with the biodiversity. Those are the mechanisms by which you can link your spatially explicit character, your quantitative character, your additive character, and your temporally responsive character, if you know what impact your money is having on those threats. And you can then link those threats to the underlying biodiversity. So to get to the substance of the presentation, this is why STAR exists. This is why it is that STAR has been designed in the way it has, is because it's responding to that very specific need, which is not addressed, I would say, by any other mechanism that we have available to us at the moment. There's lots of other ways in which people have proposed this could happen, but none of the things that I've seen have the characteristics that I included in the previous slide. So STAR's purpose is to evaluate initially the conservation gain, the opportunity that you can have for reducing species extinction risk in a particular geographical area. Now, that's obviously comes with a corollary. You can say, if you don't do this, or if you do something that worsens that risk, this is going to be the result. It's an increase in the species extinction risk in that site. And you can measure this in two different ways. You can measure how your threats are abated. This is the link to the threats I pointed out in the last slide. You can link them. You can link your actions to the abatement of threats in existing habitats. So what would happen if you were to clear this area of forest, for instance, with all its biodiversity in it? Or you can calculate the reduction in species extinction risk that would be generated by the restoration of lost habitat. And that would comprise you allowing a species to reoccupy an area of land that it had previously occupied but had been eliminated from, and therefore increasing its population because it has a larger area of land to live in. Now, within the red list of species, this is all based on the red list of species. The assumption is if you removed all those threats from all the threatened species in the world, then all those species would then be considered to be least concern. That's a kind of logical framing of the STAR metric. So what do you need in order to calculate STAR? You need to go to the red list And you need to evaluate what threat category the species you're looking at are in. And we go from near threatened to vulnerable to endangered to critically endangered. And they are all explicitly probability related. You know, the reason that a species is in the critically endangered category in the red list is because it has a specific risk of extinction over the next 5 years, 10 years. You need to know what the threats are to those species. This is already included in the red list through the threats classification scheme. Each time a species is assessed, you assign the threats that are causing that species to become extinct to that species. And you need to know where the thing lives. So there's a particular concept called the area of habitat. You can see an example of it on the right with that. I think it's a white-breasted pitter or something like that, where you take the observation of the species and you model a distribution based on the ecological requirements of that species. What kind of habitat it lives in, what elevations it lives in, and what the land cover is in the area where it lives. So the gray area is where the area of habitat is for the species. It's not the same as a range map. Range map is the big polygon. It's the area of habitat you're interested in, the gray areas here. Then, of course, we can produce some very fancy looking equations. For any given site, the threat abatement score is calculated, that's T, by the sum of all the threats, the extent of habitat of all the species that occur in that site, multiplied by the red list category of the species that occur in the site, and then the relative contribution of the threats in the site to the extinction risk of that species. And you add them all up and you can get a number, a single number for any given site. It might be 25 or it might be 500 or whatever it might be. That's a number that you can use to compare with any other site in the world in terms of the opportunity you have for reducing species extinction risk at that site. The complementary score is for restoration, where you replace the amount of current habitat for the species with the amount of restorable habitat at the site. And then you multiply the whole thing. You actually apply a discount rate because it takes a long time to do restoration. This is a discount rate of about 1/3 of the total value because of the time it takes to restore habitats. I realize this is a pretty complicated set of equations. I'm not going to go into them in great detail here, but if anybody's interested, we can go back through that subsequently. So what does STAR then give you? That number that's applied to a site could be, you know, like I say, 500 or 200 or 100 or what. That value is proportional to the change in the species extinction likelihood that you can generate at that site. That number is based on the IUCN Red List of Species. So it's generated by 10,000 plus scientists. I don't actually know how many there are who've contributed to it. I'm sure there's people on this call who are part of the Red List specialist groups who do species reviews. It's very, very hard to replicate that baseline of data, of knowledge. You have to, we spent 50 years so far on the Red List. The amount of knowledge that's gone into that is impossible to cook up in any other way. You really can only do it by generating that from a huge range of knowledgeable scientists. So the number you have, the 500 or whatever it is at a site, is calculated in order to be relevant to action. You know what that number consists of overall in terms of the species extinction risk potential you have in the site, but also what proportion of that total is contributed by each of the threats. So if you wanted to act in that site, you'd be able to say, this is the action I want to do to mitigate this threat. And that will cover 30% of the total risk of the site. If I tackle the other two big risks of the site, that might account for, say, 80% of all the extinction risk in that site. So you know what to do. You can act. You can say, I want to mitigate these threats. And I know how much extinction risk addressing each of those threats will generate. It needs to be scalable. You can, as I said, you can add up the value of STAR across sites. So if I have 5 different sites, I'm a mining company with 5 different sites, I can say that one site is 100, one site is 50, one site is 25, one site is 25. The value of the whole thing is 250 STAR units. I know what that is my potential for reducing species extinction risk across my whole portfolio. even if those sites are spread across the whole world. And then you know that if the site, say site A has one of the big issues in the site is loss of habitat from agriculture, then you can say, I know that if I reduce that risk of deforestation caused by agriculture over 5 years, I can calculate the extent to which that risk has been reduced by seeing how the deforestation rate has changed over that time. And that's where I can generate the, if you like, the credit of having made that change, is by measuring the change in the intensity of the threat as you go on. So if you do that, then you move away from this situation where you're leaving everything to the Ministry of Environment. You're basically saying anybody can contribute to this. You can have civil society organizations, you can have companies, you can have finance companies that have portfolios of hundreds of sites. You can add up the star value for each of the investments they make. We can all say, this is what we've done. And eventually, in a kind of ideal world, this is something that we're working through at the moment with the contributions platform in IUCN for IUCN members, the NGO members. What is your total contribution to species extinction risk in all the projects you're working on around the world? What proportion of the total species extinction risk that we have committed to deliver by 2050 are you delivering as IUCN members across the board, as individual IUCN members, as members of the mining sector, as members of the fashion world, as civil society organizations and Sulawesi? You can add all those things up in units and say, this is the contribution each one of those constituencies is going to make to the global target. So the paper for defining the methodology was published in Nature, Ecology and Evolution last year. I'll just run through very quickly some of the results of the paper because it's quite interesting to note where it is that it's already going to point to you. First of all, sustainability of crop and timber production, so agricultural production and timber extraction. If you were to manage making those more sustainable, then you could address 40% of the extinction risk for amphibians, mammals and birds around the world. That's a big chunk already. Another policy approach you might think of is creating new protected areas. If you were to manage key biodiversity areas around the world, you'd only have to cover about 9% of the land surface, but you'd capture 47% of the total species extinction risk reduction. If you look at it from a global map perspective, this is a map of the star scores for individual sites around the world. These are pixels at 100 kilometers squared, I believe, which shows you that the concentration of opportunity for species extinction risk reduction is pretty much where you'd expect it to be. It's in the tropics, in the tropical Andes, in West Africa, in Central Africa, in Eastern Africa and Southern Africa, Madagascar, the Western Ghats, Sri Lanka, the Himalayas, Chinese, mostly in the mountains in China, Indochina, Malaysia and Indonesia, Borneo, the Philippines, New Guinea and the Pacific Islands, and Eastern Australia. Quite a lot in the US and Canada, well, actually more in the US, lots of Caribbean and the Central America. These are places where threatened species exist at the moment. And it's quite clear, if you look, where the Congo Basin and the Amazon Basin have relatively low star scores, is because the species are not yet threatened with extinction in most cases, but they are very much going to be threatened with extinction if the processes that are going ahead with clearance of the forest in those habitats continue. The thing about STAR is you can break it out by the threats. So this little map down in the corner here, rather sort of mutated in shape, shows you the potential you have for reducing species extinction risk only by addressing the question of invasive and problematic species, one of the key threats within STAR. And you can see that Australia, particularly Tasmania and the East Coast and New Zealand, and the outlying islands of the Indonesian archipelago are the places where you can really generate some very big yields there. That's because of the presence of, in Australia, things like foxes and cats, in New Zealand, possums, in the Pacific Islands, as with all over in the world and on small islands, things like rats. So you can break the star map out by any one of those threats. So you can show where it is around the world that action to address those threats is going to have most benefit for reducing species extinction risk. This is the analysis of the threats globally. And I've listed them in order of how they line up with the top 5 threats that were identified by the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES. You have annual and perennial non-timber crops, logging and wood harvesting, livestock farming and ranching, and residential and commercial developments, which are changes in land and sea use as the top threats. Direct exploitation of organisms, invasive and other problematic species, sorry, that's invasive alien species. Hunting and collecting terrestrial animals comes out, with a relatively large proportion. And then climate change and severe weather comes out rather higher up. Pollution higher up too. So you can see that this changes in land and sea use is the most obvious place to start. That's where you could incentivize businesses to change their practices to avoid areas and also to invest in conservation where it's important. If you look at it from the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, you can see that the burden or the opportunity for reducing species extinction risk is very different across the world. In fact, you can see that the 3 highest countries with opportunity for delivering species extinction risk reduction are Indonesia, Colombia, and Madagascar. Mexico, Brazil, and China, I think, come quite a close second to that. But there's lots of countries in the world with a relatively low opportunity for reducing species extinction risk, but a very, very large burden to carry in terms of the impact that they are having through the consumption of commodities that are grown in those countries, which have a very large opportunity for reducing extinction risk. So UK, US, Europe, we should be taking a greater responsibility for the opportunity that you have for reducing species extinction risk in Indonesia because of the commodities that we buy that are produced in Indonesia that are causing that biodiversity risk. So a couple of ideas about how you can assemble the contributions that go into STAR. You can imagine, for instance, we've got 5 or 6 different examples here in a single landscape. You can imagine that there's a philanthropic investment that goes into one place up here that eliminates invasive species. You've got indigenous people who take over the management of a forest and reduce unsustainable logging. You've got a private finance investment that converts a commercial agricultural intervention into sustainable farming. And you've got the improved management of a national park, and then a mining concession, which is improved by the restoration of degraded habitat. What you have here is a way of adding those things up within a landscape, which show you that this is completely imaginary, as you might imagine, but that 6% of the total STAR value for the whole country could be delivered by these contributions in this landscape. So what you can do is you can attribute the components of that global, that national level effort to those different organizations, the philanthropic investors, the indigenous people, the private finance institution, the government, and a mining company, and show that they've all contributed to that total. It's not all down to the Ministry of Environment to do this. Now, I've come back to this slide just very quickly because I think it's worth pointing out how important it is to make sure that you can track where it is that the STAR units, if you like, are flowing up the chain here, so that you can reflect back where it is that you should be taking your responsibility as a producer, as a consumer government. So on the left-hand side, you've got these municipalities here, and you can track the footprint of this municipality through these grey lines. So it goes through this importer company to this country. You know that commodity is being tracked through that chain, through those companies, but you don't know those companies, those importers and exporters don't necessarily know where they're buying that component from. And if you try and track this back to its source, that's very difficult to do with things like beef and soya. So one policy option that we have that will increase our ability to hold the producers and the consumers accountable for this is to put pressure on these importers and exporters to be more explicit about where they are actually sourcing their products from. And that will allow investment to flow from a country, Russia in this case, back to a municipality on the ground that will support that municipality to produce their commodity in such a way that they're not destroying biodiversity. With this system as it is, it's impossible to do that. You can't make that connection. And that's why biodiversity is disappearing. It's because of the opaqueness of these commodity chains. So what is there that's not yet ready, not yet finished with STAR? Well, first of all, we've only got in our existing heat map layers, which are available through the integrated biodiversity assessment tool, we have amphibians, birds, and mammals as the core layer of taxa. Reptiles are ready to go. We should be including them within the next year. A couple of other taxa, freshwater fish, we hope within the next year. Reef fish, reef building corals and trees in the next 2 years after that. And there's a whole bunch of other groups of taxa of plants which could be included at the national scale where that data exists. That means that we hope within 2 years we'll be able to include in the heat map, that is to say the calculation of species extinction risk reduction potential, the major taxa that are related to ecosystems and loss of biodiversity. We're assuming that the threat impacts that are generated by these production systems are constant across the species ranges. For small species, that's probably true. For big species, tigers, elephants, and things, it's probably not true. But we're refining that using global threat heat maps. I'll come back to the issue about assessments being provisional in a minute, and that also concerns this issue to do with newly emerging or worsening threats, where newly emerging threats which haven't yet manifested in the designation of threatened species on the red list, such as is the case in Amazonia, means that there are emerging threats that are not completely covered in the STAR metric. So STAR is intended not only as a method for people to assess the situation, the static situation as now in a site. It's intended to inform how you can improve that situation. And the way you do this is by working through a pathway from the estimated STAR to a calibrated STAR to a delivered STAR. And those 3 steps are, you start with your data report for your site in the integrated biodiversity assessment tool. That's based on existing published information in the red list. And that gives you a preliminary evaluation of the potential of a site or landscape to contribute to threatened species conservation. What you then need to do is to validate that based on current knowledge of the baseline, which is whether confirming that the species are there and confirming the threats that are present. There's a whole protocol set up to do this. It's kind of similar to your validation step if you were doing this for emissions reductions. You can do a kind of high-level estimate of what you might be able to generate from emissions reductions at a site, but you then have to validate that on the ground. This is the same kind of process. What you can then do once you've got that baseline, you can say, for instance, that you have a deforestation rate caused by production of soy of 5% a year in your site. You can then say, I will aim to generate STAR targets of reducing that by 100%, why not, over 10 years. And so my target is 0 deforestation in 10 years. That calculation can tell you how much species extinction risk reduction you've generated through addressing that threat on the species that are present in the form of a STAR score. And you can therefore cost out how much that would be to implement that management regime, see whether you achieve those targets over time, and then report the achievement of those targets to a national authority or to the CBD or whoever else it might be. So we're doing lots of different things with STAR at the moment. We are working on national contributions through something called the Biodiv 2030 project. We're working on using STAR in the Task Force for Nature-Based Financial Disclosure as a measure of biodiversity impact risk. We're proposing to the World Bank that STAR can be used as a key performance indicator for debt restructuring actions. We've just had a very excellent collaboration with a student from Arizona, Camila, who's developed an investment strategy for biodiversity in Colombia using STAR. We're also using STAR as a means to select and manage portfolios for conservation impact funds, the CPIC Morova Nature Plus Accelerator. And we are looking at investigating, this is early stages, investigating ways for companies to assess their corporate footprints through the Science Based Targets Network, where they don't know where the products that they are using, the commodities they're putting into their products, where they don't know where they're coming from, but have a general idea. You can weight the STAR value by the amount of that commodity that that company is buying from a province or a country, and that can be used to calculate the STAR score. I can go into these in great detail if anybody's interested subsequently. So, to round up, we should be just about on time, 45 minutes. The conclusions we have as a result of this discussion are that if we don't find a way to redirect an enormous amount of money in the world, we're going to lose all our biodiversity and we'll be completely screwed. We will not have a viable planet to live on. So this isn't just something that ministries of the environment need to do, it's everybody has to do this. And everybody has to push as much as they can to encourage governments, for instance, to recognize this, companies too. Now, the only way that people can actually react to this situation is if they have something they can measure that is a recognizable and viable indication of the fact that they made something change. Otherwise, they will have no confidence that they spent their money with any value. So the metric that we use has to be linked to flows of finance. And that's where the threats come in. The threats link the finance to the biodiversity. And that metric has to be, as I said before, scalable, responsive, bottom-up, and scientifically solid. And that's what STAR has been designed to do. So I think we have a couple of questions up already, but that's my last slide. Thank you very much for listening.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Hawkins, for sharing this with us. We have a couple of questions that have come through, so we'll start at the top. The first question is, how could companies make more money by investing into biodiversity? The return on investment would be a desirable goal for public good, but not directly for private companies.
Yes, that's a very good question. So I'm, as was mentioned earlier by Vera, a founder of the Coalition for Private Investments in Conservation. And there are actually, well, we have about 90 odd members. I would refer you to the website for information about how that kind of investment process can work. The simple answer is that there are lots of commercial opportunities for companies that are interested to deliver biodiversity outcomes as well as return on investment. And that can bring a whole range of different revenue generating opportunities to companies from lots of different agricultural commodity production systems. If they are able to demonstrate that they have committed to no deforestation, for instance, then they are able to sell their products on markets they don't have access to. It will be the case in the future that if companies don't make those kinds of commitments, they'll be excluded from those markets by legislation. So it's as much a question of them having to go along with those rules in order to be able to continue making money as it is to make more money from conservation actions. So the important thing is to make sure that companies understand how it is that they are contributing to conservation as part of their work so that they can maximize it. And that's what they haven't been able to do up to this point. So second question from Emma Goethe. This is more of a professional development question. But if we want to truly make an impact and use STAR as a tool to shift corporate action, what kind of position should we be seeking professionally? That's a really excellent question. Well, my personal view is that there are lots and lots and lots of companies out there who are looking for help in this at the moment. And what we are doing is fighting a kind of fire hose of demand for people who want to understand how it is that they can use things like STAR to advance. So I would suggest that the thing to do to advance your career path, if you like, in this direction, would be to spend a lot of time doing research on things like the Task Force for Nature-Based Financial Disclosure, the Science-Based Targets Network, how it is that the Coalition for Private Investments is setting up investments that can generate impacts on biodiversity, and try and work with companies who look as if they might be interested to be able to do that kind of thing, and investigate the specific character, the specific nature of the way they interact with biodiversity at the land use scale. So you might imagine there could be a fashion company that's sourcing wood pulp from plantations around the world, figuring out from them where it is they get their wood pulp, what kinds of plantations it comes from, what the sort of reputation of the plantation producers is like, working through that process with them so that they can evaluate whether they're having an impact on biodiversity, and if they are, which of their plantations is the one that's most exposed to biodiversity-related risk, and how then they can moderate that risk by using a tool like STAR. That's the kind of pathway that we need lots and lots of people working on at the moment. So, second question from Mr. Lewis. Will the STAR metric be used to help countries orient and measure their contributions against biodiversity, perhaps by building biodiversity finance such as the carbon market? Yes, so one thing that is very actively being discussed at the moment is the idea of biodiversity credits, which kind of a similar kind of thing to a carbon credit, where for a carbon credit you agree by changing the management of land that you're responsible for, you're reducing emissions that come from deforestation, and you can then sell that credit onto somebody else as an offset because they are not doing that thing, and you end up with a sort of net neutral, net zero position. There is opportunity for doing this with biodiversity. Of course, the great thing about biodiversity is it's very locally specific. A ton of carbon is a ton of carbon, but a ton of biodiversity is not a ton of biodiversity. It's a ton of lots of different things which don't really equate to each other. The big principle here is called like for like. In the biodiversity offsets world, you can only do a biodiversity offset if you're dealing with like kinds of biodiversity, so species or ecosystems. If you want to sell a product to somebody as a contribution to the conservation of biodiversity, it has to be measured in the same components as the thing you're trying to offset, and that's a big challenge. We're working through this with some principles on how it is you can develop biodiversity credits right at the moment, so watch this space. Has STAR been used with the palm oil industry in places such as Borneo and Sumatra? And can you give an example of outcomes for this for animals such as orangutans? So we haven't done oil palm specifically, but we have done a number of collaborations with rubber plantations in Sumatra. And of course, they are also very implicated in issues to do with, particularly where you're converting primary forests into rubber plantations with orangutans. So this is a case where you could imagine an offset being operational, where if you're destroying an area of orangutan habitat, you could put into place a biodiversity credit where you conserve, or you manage, or you improve, or you restore 10 times that amount of orangutan habitat somewhere else. You have to do it with like for like, so you have to be using the same subspecies or species of orangutan, and you have to demonstrate that your impact is actually going to be explicit in that case. But it's tough to do for the range of other species that also occur in the habitat where orangutans live, because they don't follow the same distribution patterns as the orangutan. So it's a tricky thing to do in terms of a biodiversity credit in that way. But you can certainly show what the impact of the creation of a plantation of oil palm or rubber would be in terms of where you put it in a landscape, and you can minimize your potential for increasing species extinction risk by choosing a part of that landscape that doesn't impact things like orangutans or any other form of biodiversity that's important.
And we had a question come through in the chat as well on how do we engage decision makers such as countries or companies in actually using the tool? How do or can methods to convert natural assets to financial capital embrace the plurality of values associated with those assets? Can we monetize nature?
I think monetizing nature has a really bad reputation. People have been very much up in arms at the idea you should be putting a dollar figure on nature. The raw issue, the raw bottom line is that if you can't find a way for companies to assess risk and opportunity, which are essentially financial equations that are imposed upon them by their treatment of biodiversity, they will just take it. Thank you very much. Goody, goody. I've got lots of biodiversity. I can sell it off. Nobody's worried about it. You have to be able to find a way for it to be a thing that companies account for. And the way you can do that, the two most powerful things, as I mentioned, is to make it evident that if they don't, it's a risk to them. They are risking losing money because they're not doing the right thing for biodiversity. And this can be through regulation, or it can be through legal methods, or it can be through shareholder pressure. There's lots of shareholder pressure out at the moment, pushing companies to evaluate what their impacts are on biodiversity, and that then comes out to be a number. You can tell what the cost to a company is of being sued for destroying biodiversity. It's a reduction in their corporate value. That is a number. If that's what you call monetizing biodiversity, that's essential. I don't think there's a particularly strong argument to be made for ways that companies can just trade biodiversity credits globally in the way you can for carbon. It's just not compatible with the way in which biodiversity is distributed. But you can certainly manage risk. You can find a way to build markets for managing risk. So you can imagine a company has found that it's exposed to a very substantial amount of risk by creating an oil palm plantation in Borneo. There's a market then that is created for people who can tell them how to improve that. And what that market does is it increases value for the company that's managing that risk, the ones that's setting up the oil palm, because they are improving their shareholder value through not destroying biodiversity that's valued by the world, and they're giving money to another company to help them do that. So you're creating value for the other company as well. So if that's what you call monetizing biodiversity, I think that's great. I don't think you can trade it in the way you can for carbon, however. Shall I just move on to the next question on the list there?
Yes, please.
Vera, yep.
Yeah.
So how to apply the STAR metric at the scale of the African continent, for instance, for orienting the new Nature Africa Continental Conservation Programme. Yes, so the data is freely available through the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool, IBAT for I forget what the website is now. I can put it up in the commentary afterwards. That will enable you to calculate the potential for reducing species extinction risk at the site level, and you can't get bigger than, I think, a few 100,000 square kilometers for that measure. What we can do is we can produce a map that shows you the potential for reducing species extinction risk at the African scale, and then break it out by country. And then you can see how it is that each country can focus their efforts to reduce species extinction risk because of the heat map. You can just see where that heat map shows you the opportunities are. And then when you break the heat map out into threat layers, you can see what threats you need to address in those areas where the potential for reducing species extinction risk is greatest. But that's a very, very nice way of using STAR that could be appropriate for that Nature Africa enterprise that you mentioned. So a question about nature positive outcomes in the animal agriculture industry. Yes. So this is a really good example. If this is an example of this would be the beef question that I showed earlier. Cattle ranching in South America is probably among the most important drivers of biodiversity loss there are in the world. So if you measure, for instance, STAR values for the Cerrado, you have massive species loss caused by extension of cattle ranching. There is the corollary of this is there's actually quite a lot of momentum building for improving the production of high quality beef from non-extensive ranching in places where biodiversity risk is highest through companies that can find supplementary concessional finance that's only available to them if they agree to transform their production practices. we have a number of examples of this kind of approach in the CPIC website. And the challenge with this is the transformation that the ranchers need to make from the extensive forest burning approach to an intensive, high quality production system. But there are means to cover that gap, cover that opportunity gap you have through finance mechanisms that are specifically designed to help ranchers do that because of the impacts they can generate for biodiversity. And what the finance world can also do in those circumstances is to connect the ranchers that are producing that zero deforestation beef with consumers. McDonald's is a very good example, who are prepared to pay more money for that beef. So there's lots of ways in which that approach can be adapted in lots of other places around the world for different crops. It's a very good question. Because the Aichi targets were not met, should parties lower their aim, or should ending extinction still be the guidepost? I think the really important realization that the world has come to, at least I hope this is what the world has come to, is that it's just simply absurd to construct the Aichi targets with the only agency available to deliver it being the ministries of environment around the world. They are completely incapable of delivering that kind of outcome. The approach that we've got with a thing like STAR is that you're spreading that responsibility and that opportunity and that benefit across a whole range of different organizations that were previously incapable of participating in this process. So I think retaining the zero extinction target is the right thing to do. The really significant change is expanding by multiple orders of magnitude the constituency of people who can help deliver it and who know how to make money flow in order that that target be achieved.
And then I think I have one question that might be
Sure.
very relevant to all of us who have attended today. More holistically, what is the smallest step that a person can take that can help us move towards the protection of biodiversity?
Smallest, individual personal step? That's a really good question. I think it's a similar question to that of climate, actually. I think diet is the place to start. I think stop eating meat, and particularly, or reduce the consumption of meat, red meat particularly. Focus on a grain-based diet where you can. I think making it clear that the money that you spend is intended to be able to sustain biodiversity rather than destroy it. And by the money you spend, I don't just mean the money you spend buying food, I mean your pension fund. Where is your pension company, the money that you put in every month to your pension, spending its way? Where is it investing? If it's not investing in stuff that it contributes to sustainability, they need to know that, and you need to tell them, that kind of thing.
Excellent. Well, thank you again for your time and for sharing with us the work that has been done and that you have led towards conserving biodiversity. It's been very informational. We're very grateful for your time today.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I look forward to hearing from you in the future.
Thank you.